Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners from the lands from which we're meeting and the lands about which we'll talk about. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So this is the final session of 12 in our planning workshops for economics. And the intention here today is really just to be able to sum up any of the kind of key findings that emerged along the way. So let's just jump straight into this. So a quick background. So economics platform, there are four main components. There's a high-level economics plan for coming up with investment portfolios, economics project for farm scale modelling and the impacts of modelling the impacts of individual actions, being able to report the outcomes of those actions or the intended outcomes of planned investments, and also the ability to facilitate getting those projects into marketplaces for investment in NRM. So this collective series of workshops has been about the first stage, the economics plan, which is a sub-catchment level lumped modelling approach. The whole intention here is about generating rapid investment portfolio generation. Our audience here are investors and the users of those same investors and the organisations that largely facilitate investment programs like NRM bodies, local government authorities. And what we're shooting for here is a consistent approach across large spatial areas to come up with investment portfolios. This economics plan, so far we've got about 150 alternate NRM actions that we're considering, and those actions are typically either agricultural practice improvement or interventions such as riparian revegetation, and the associated support mechanisms that go along with the action with the on-ground work, such as a grant or an extension of support. So we're trying to consider the on-ground activity and the support around them. Collectively call that an action. And the intent then is that, as you can see over on the right-hand side, be able to come up with different ways of prioritising the relative importance of the different aspects of an investment portfolio, and ultimately you get a sorted list of potential actions. And in that sorted list, we quantify the likely outcomes. So what's novel is that we're not dealing with a single constituent or measure, but we care about water quality, biodiversity, First Nations, social, economic and climate change. And we have a novel interface for investors to explore by region or by value their portfolio. We're representing the confidence associated with our predicted outcomes and the confidence associated with the cost estimates around that. We're representing the temporal response as well of the response of those actions to be able to differentiate between fast acting, so pouring concrete, dumping rocks, or long-term responses which are typically cheaper, such as revegetation works. And we're also including the adoption potential. So the greatest on-ground action still has to be adopted and implemented by landholders. So far we've had 11 different workshop sessions, an initial overview, background to where we've done similar things in the Great Barrier Reef. We had a session on actions and measures, just to make sure that there weren't some novel actions that we hadn't considered that wouldn't work with the proposed modelling approach. And then the modelling approach, the biophysical modelling approaches, and the way that we propose to handle confidence, and also how we would handle the semi-quantitative and, say, qualitative approach. We talked about how to quantify biodiversity, and the upshot from that was we're not going to try and quantify biodiversity, but as a proxy we use vegetation and changes in remnant vegetation cover, both terrestrial and wetland. That was discussed in section 6 in the biophysical data. Session 7, the biodiversity data. We had a session on considering business as usual, and the purpose of business as usual is how do we account for the value of avoided destruction, and our approach here is effectively to implement actions, which is the continued clearing as the business as usual. So effectively, if you do nothing, you'll get a continuing decline. And so therefore, we can include actions of preventing that destruction as a way to present value around avoided destruction. We had a session on environmental accounting, and this is really about what are the elements, the cost elements of an on-ground action that need to be captured and also need to be represented to inform investors, which cost components matter. And also we talked around the topics um, of indexing, so to account for future increases in price of doing actions, and discounting as well, so effectively accounting for future value in current dollar terms. We had a session on First Nations and how we intend to represent kind of impact of actions on First Nations interests, and now we're up to the final session here. So the upshot from all of those sessions was overall super positive, um, general support for the intent and approach. And it was great everyone who attended these sessions really were constructive and supportive. So it's not to say that there wasn't some mild discomfort with some aspects, but we couldn't sort of come up with alternatives that were fast and pragmatic to implement in this first round. So we fully acknowledge there's going to be future versions that need refinement once we kind of get this thing live and being tested. The potential deal breakers that I was most concerned about it, and why we wanted to run these sessions, was about how we propose and how we have already in the Reefonomics application, how we quantify the action effectiveness and to see if they're fit for purpose. And so generally supportive of that for both the quantitative and the qualitative approach. Um, our approach to representing the confidence in the predicted change and costs, they seem to be fit for purpose and appropriate, and meet the needs, most importantly, of the audience for this tool, which are the investors. And the approach to representing business usual, the logic seems sound, but we've not done this before, so we need to test this as data and see how we go. So through the collective discussions, we've grown the series of values and measures. So we're at 7 values. So the values, this is really about being able to aggregate the individual measures for reporting, because we're ending up at the moment, we've got 17 different measures, way too many to present on an interface and make sense of. So we lump those up into a smaller group and allow the users to drill down further. So we're looking at these values of productivity, water quality, biodiversity, First Nations, social, economic and climate change. And the measures, you can see the first one, sediment loads there, spans across water quality and productivity. So what we're trying to avoid here is an exercise in autocorrelation. So the process, it's effectively hill slope erosion processes, will impact on land productivity through soil loss, but also impact on water quality through increases in fine sediment. So we've got a whole series of things here. Dissolved inorganic nitrogen, salinity, still a question mark around how to represent that. The microbial loads, we've got a series of vegetation-related things for our biodiversity. So a series of different wetland measures, so riverine, lacustrine, palustrine, and estuaries, and then terrestrial woody vegetation. For First Nations, we're capturing largely all these other elements impact on First Nations, but things that are specifically and uniquely First Nations are around the level of direct engagement of First Nations in actions and the level of on-country impact of those actions. We've got under social, it's just the community engagement component to represent the social, and economic industry economic and regional economics, so it's nothing to do with the individual landholder economics, because that's fundamentally included as part of the costs of implementing the action. So we're trying to capture the broader economic impacts of doing actions. And for climate change, we've got carbon sequestration, land resilience, and methane production. So to give that a little bit more context, if we've got an action, we need to consider and try and quantify, represented by these arrows, the relative effectiveness of those action, or the relative effect of that action on each of the measures, and then we can sum those up for a reporting sense for our values. And how that sort of generally works, in the computational approach, we've got an area available to do work. We've got a series of the base condition for each of our measures. We've got our actions. It gets applied over an area. It's got an effectiveness on each of those underlying measures. We apply the action, do some accounting, change the available area, update the relative state of that base measure. So what we also have here is the confidence in how we've quantified the underlying measure. We've got a confidence in our ability to predict the impact on that measure. So we propagate those through to represent the overall confidence in our predicted outcome. And then we also do the same thing from the cost perspective. So we've got a confidence around our cost estimates per action. And then when we go through to collate the overall portfolio, we've got a confidence in our overall budget predictions for the portfolio. So from here, we're deep into the design phase. In fact, we've started even some of the initial data wrangling component here as well. We'll have that complete early next year. The build phase will probably start before that, but ultimately we're looking to have a prototype build by the end of March next year, with then some prototype testing in the Southern Queensland Landscapes NRM region, and we'll have a round of review and refinement at that stage. So by the end of April next year, we hope to have something ready for re-engaging with this audience again. So a live tool that implements all the elements that we've spoken about through these sessions, and with a view then to have something that we can show more publicly by the middle of next year. So I'll post this video along with where all the other videos are on the economics.net.au website. And thank you for attending this session and all the previous ones.